The chamber was heavy with silence, the kind that comes before thunder. Rows of polished wood gleamed under the lights, and the weight of authority seemed to press down on everyone present. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, composed as ever, had just delivered a statement that drew polite nods from her peers. It was measured, dignified, the kind of reasoning that carried the gravity of the court itself. For a moment, it felt as if the conversation was over. And then, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward. Her voice cut through the air, respectful but unmistakably sharp. "Justice Jackson, with all due respect, I cannot agree with that conclusion. In fact, I believe it risks overlooking the very people who trust us to see them, fully and without condition." The room froze. Every head turned. You could almost hear the air being sucked from the chamber. To disagree openly with a sitting Supreme Court justice was rare enough, but to do so in such clear, unshaken tones? It was unthinkable. Crockett's words didn't carry anger. They carried conviction. She didn't waver, didn't retreat into polite ambiguity. Instead, she held her gaze steady, as if to say, "I know exactly what I'm doing." Some whispered to their neighbors, eyes wide. A few faces tightened in disapproval, while others betrayed a flicker of admiration they could not hide. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was deliberate. A respectful defiance that sliced through the hierarchy of titles and robes, placing one woman's truth against the highest court in the land. Justice Jackson, unflinching, adjusted her notes with the calm precision that made her a national symbol of steadiness. But her pause, longer than usual, did not go unnoticed. The tension doubled. Crockett had just cracked open a door no one expected her to touch, and now everyone leaned in, desperate to see what would happen next. For years, people had been conditioned to treat the court's words as final, almost sacred. Yet here was a representative from Texas, a woman shaped by grit and struggle, daring to say aloud what many only murmured in private. And as the silence stretched, one question burned in every mind: what could possibly give her the courage to take this stand? Because if the disagreement itself shook the chamber, what followed would shake the entire legal world. The silence after Crockett's defiant words was not just awkward, it was historic. This wasn't about disagreeing on the margins of a legal text or quibbling over a procedural detail. The issue at the center of the clash cut to the heart of America's identity: who gets seen, who gets heard, and who gets counted as fully belonging in the eyes of the law. Justice Jackson had framed her position with the authority of precedent. She pointed to the stability of institutions, the need for continuity, the careful balance that had guided decisions for decades. Her reasoning was meticulous, grounded in the weight of centuries-old doctrine. For many, it was unassailable. After all, what could possibly be more secure than the word of a Supreme Court justice? But Jasmine Crockett was not moved. To her, this was not just a legal opinion, it was a line in the sand. Because buried beneath the calm reasoning lay an assumption that millions of ordinary people could not afford to accept. The question at stake was whether the system would once again prioritize tradition over justice, form over substance, stability over equality. Crockett knew the risks. Challenging a justice so directly was like stepping into a storm with nothing but conviction as a shield. The cameras were rolling. The political establishment was watching. Every word she spoke could be replayed, dissected, weaponized. Allies might admire her bravery in private, but in public? Many would distance themselves. In a town where ambition often demands silence, Crockett's defiance looked less like strategy and more like self-destruction. And yet, there was something about the moment that went beyond politics. For communities who had waited too long to be acknowledged, immigrants, workers, people of color, her refusal to nod politely carried the weight of representation. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had been told their struggles were unfortunate but not legally relevant. Everyone who had been patted on the head by the system and told to wait their turn. This is why the chamber shook. It wasn't just that Crockett disagreed. It was that she dared to elevate lived reality over institutional tradition. She dared to say the quiet truth out loud, that justice is meaningless if it excludes those who need it most. Reporters scribbled furiously. Legal analysts exchanged glances. Was this the spark of a broader reckoning, or a reckless gamble that would end a promising career? The stakes could not have been higher. If Crockett faltered, she would be painted as unqualified, impulsive, reckless. If she succeeded, she would become a voice too powerful to ignore. The room, and the country beyond it, held its breath. Because in that single moment, it felt as if two competing visions of America were colliding, one rooted in deference to the past, the other demanding recognition of the present. But the question on everyone's mind was, could she back it up? Or was this political suicide? The answer would come from an unexpected place. The figure Crockett confronted was not just Justice Jackson herself, but the larger shadow she represented, the towering edifice of a legal tradition that too often valued its own permanence above the people it claimed to serve. To understand the weight of Crockett's defiance, you have to see the other side for what it was, a fortress of intellect, marble, and precedent that prided itself on being untouchable. Imagine the old corridors of the establishment, mahogany desks where clerks whisper about precedent as if it were scripture, courtrooms where polished phrases matter more than lived experience. In those spaces, human pain is distilled into footnotes. A family losing their home is reduced to plaintiff. A woman fighting for recognition becomes petitioner. The names disappear. Only the doctrine remains. This was the world Crockett pushed against. And the world did not bend easily. Its defenders, cloaked in titles and black robes, saw themselves as guardians of order. They spoke of stability, consistency, deference. But what they really meant was control. They saw empathy as bias, humanity as weakness. Take, for instance, the fictionalized Judge Will Call Justice Harland, a composite of the establishment's voice. Harland prided himself on never letting emotion cloud his judgment. The law is the law, he'd declare in chambers, his colleagues nodding. But beneath that certainty lay a cold truth. He had never walked the streets where families feared eviction, never sat at the kitchen table of a mother who couldn't afford medicine, never had to explain to a child why the system didn't recognize their parents' sacrifice. His rulings, though technically sound, left human wreckage in their wake. There was arrogance, too, in the way these gatekeepers carried themselves. At conferences, Harland would smirk at younger lawyers who spoke of justice as if it were alive. Idealism fades, he'd say, swirling his glass of scotch. Precedent remains. To him, people like Crockett were dangerous, too fiery, too willing to bend the law toward compassion. He saw her type before, activists in suits, as he called them, who mistook empathy for intellect. But this arrogance carried its own contradictions. For all their talk of objectivity, the establishment bent when it suited their interests. Corporate power was often shielded. Communities without wealth or influence were told to wait. Doctrine became a sword for some, a cage for others. They called it neutrality, but neutrality always seemed to favor the strong. The irony was bitter. They championed equal justice under law, while blind to the unequal weight of their decisions. They insisted the system was colorblind, yet it was communities of color who bore the brunt of their rulings. They spoke of patience, yet demanded that those already waiting in the margins continue waiting still. This was the villain Crockett stood against, not a single person, but an entire worldview. A worldview where intellect was prized over humanity, where precedent mattered more than progress, where dignity was acknowledged only in theory but not in practice. Foreshadowing hung in the air. Because arrogance always sows the seeds of its downfall. The establishment believed it was unassailable. That no one would dare challenge the sanctity of its words. But arrogance blinds. It blinds to the rising anger in communities long ignored. It blinds to the power of a voice unwilling to be silenced. And on that day, in that chamber, arrogance met its match. To understand why Jasmine Crockett spoke with such clarity, you have to know where she came from. Hers was not the polished path of privilege, paved with Ivy League connections and inherited opportunity. Hers was the path of grit. Of working twice as hard to be heard half as much. Born into a community that knew struggle as an everyday reality, Crockett grew up watching neighbors fight battles the system barely noticed. Evictions. Over-policing. Schools without resources. She didn't just study injustice, she lived alongside it. And even as a child, she bristled at the idea that fairness was a privilege reserved for the few. Her early years were marked by sacrifice. She worked jobs that left her exhausted but determined. When others told her law school wasn't for people like her, she treated it as fuel. And when she finally entered those halls of power, she carried with her not just textbooks, but the weight of her community's expectations. Unlike the establishment's gatekeepers, Crockett didn't view empathy as weakness. She saw it as the sharpest weapon against indifference. As a public defender, she stood in courtrooms where the stakes weren't abstract, they were freedom, family, survival. She represented clients who couldn't afford a voice, and in every case, she learned the same lesson: justice delayed was justice denied. But Crockett was more than a lawyer. She was a fighter with fire in her voice. Her speeches on the House floor carried the raw energy of someone who had nothing to lose but her dignity. She was unafraid to call out hypocrisy, unafraid to stand alone if that was what the truth required. Her style was often dismissed by the polished elite as too brash, but her constituents saw it for what it was: honesty without disguise. Her authenticity was her armor. She didn't posture, she didn't flatter. She spoke in the rhythm of her people, and that rhythm made her dangerous to those who relied on silence to maintain control. Every scar from her journey sharpened her resolve. She had faced dismissiveness, mockery, and doubt, but none of it broke her. If anything, it built the conviction that no title, not even justice, placed someone above accountability. And this is why, in that chamber, Crockett was uniquely prepared. Others might have nodded politely, swallowed their questions, and deferred to precedent. But Crockett could not. Her life had taught her too well what silence costs. She could see the flaw that others pretended wasn't there, because she had lived in its shadow. So when the moment came, when the weight of tradition bore down, she did what only she could: she spoke truth to power with the calm of someone who had nothing left to fear. With the entire country watching, the stage was set for a showdown. And the truth, it turned out, was even more dramatic than the headline suggested. The chamber was no longer still. It pulsed with anticipation, the kind of energy that makes even seasoned observers sit straighter in their seats. Cameras zoomed in, pens poised above notepads, every breath caught in the weight of the moment. Justice Jackson adjusted her notes, her voice steady as she began her prepared argument. It was masterful, at least on the surface. Each word flowed with the cadence of authority, carefully measured, bolstered by precedent stacked like bricks in a wall. She spoke of constitutional consistency, of balance, of restraint in the face of shifting tides. It was the kind of argument that had silenced countless challengers before. Her voice carried not just logic but the weight of an institution that had outlasted wars, depressions, and revolutions. For many listening, it sounded invincible. Every citation, every clause, every turn of phrase reinforced the fortress she represented. She leaned on centuries of judicial wisdom, daring anyone to question it. For a moment, it seemed as if Crockett's bold challenge would dissolve into history as little more than a fleeting spark. But then Crockett leaned forward, her posture composed, her expression unshaken. She did not interrupt rudely, nor did she rush her words. Instead, she waited for the briefest pause, then let her counterpoint fall like a blade sharpened by lived experience. Justice, the law is not only a shield for tradition, it must be a mirror for truth. If precedent blinds us to reality, then precedent fails its purpose. The words were calm, but they landed with precision. The room stiffened. A few heads turned toward her, eyes wide, as if they had just witnessed a fracture in the wall of certainty. Jackson pressed on, but now there was an edge to her delivery. Her voice, once smooth, carried the faintest trace of strain. She cited case after case, building her tower of logic higher, faster, as though to drown out the echo of Crockett's challenge. But Crockett remained steady, her pen resting lightly on her notes, her expression one of quiet resolve. When her turn came again, she struck with another line, delivered not with anger, but with an almost surgical composure. We cannot call justice blind when it only fails to see certain people. Neutrality that ignores suffering is not neutrality, it is neglect. Gasps rippled through the audience. The air tightened. Crockett's words weren't just a rebuttal, they were a moral mirror, reflecting the weakness of a doctrine that claimed to be impartial while leaving millions in the shadows. Jackson adjusted her robe, cleared her throat. She responded quickly, perhaps too quickly, citing another precedent, but the confidence of her earlier delivery had dimmed. Observers noticed it. Analysts scribbled harder. Something had shifted. Crockett didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice. She simply let the silence after her words linger, filling the chamber with the quiet power of truth spoken plainly. Every time Jackson pressed harder, Crockett's restraint made her strength more visible. Her calm became its own form of defiance, and with each exchange, the justice seemed a little more unsettled. The tension was no longer just between two women at opposite ends of the chamber. It spread to the audience itself, who felt torn between the weight of history and the urgency of the present. Could this young congresswoman truly be unraveling the arguments of one of the most respected voices on the bench? The debate escalated, each point sharpening the contrast. Jackson's fortress of precedent loomed, but Crockett's precision strikes exposed cracks where light could pour through. The clash was no longer just intellectual, it was personal, moral, visceral. And as the justice's voice faltered ever so slightly, the audience felt the shift. For the first time, the establishment's certainty looked fragile. The chamber braced itself, because the next exchange would not just challenge authority, it would threaten to shatter it entirely. The room was so still you could hear the soft whir of the cameras, the low hum of the air conditioning, and the faint shuffling of papers as if every sound was amplified in the silence. The opponent had just finished their carefully crafted monologue, their voice dripping with the confidence of someone certain they had cornered their adversary. Their closing words hung in the air like a heavy curtain. The law is not about feelings, it is about order. And order requires discipline, not sentiment. For a moment, no one moved. Then, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze unwavering. The pause alone felt like a declaration. She let it linger, drawing every pair of eyes in the chamber to her. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and filled with a quiet authority that made the hairs on the back of necks stand up. Respectfully, she began, her tone measured yet resolute, "What you call order, I call silence. And silence is not justice, it is surrender." A ripple went through the audience, a mixture of gasps and murmurs. The opponent stiffened, clearly unprepared for the sharp precision of her words. Crockett didn't rush. She allowed the weight of her opening to settle before continuing, every sentence designed like a step in a staircase leading upward. "You insist the law exists apart from human experience," she said, "as if statutes and precedents descend from the sky untouched by the people they govern. But that is a myth. The law is written by human hands. It is argued by human voices. It shapes, and is shaped by, human lives. To deny that reality is to deny the very purpose of law itself." The opponent's brow furrowed, their jaw tightening as Crockett's words landed like precise blows. They reached for their notes, but Crockett was already pressing forward. "Consider this," she continued, her voice rising just slightly, enough to sharpen the edge. "When enslaved people were once told they had no legal standing as persons, was that order? When women were denied the right to vote, was that discipline? When Japanese-American families were forced into camps, stripped of dignity under the banner of law, was that justice, or was it silence disguised as order?" Gasps erupted again, louder this time, followed by a wave of nods among the crowd. Crockett paused deliberately, giving the audience space to absorb the historical weight she had summoned into the room. The opponent's face betrayed a flicker of panic, their well-rehearsed confidence beginning to unravel. "And here," she pressed on, "is the truth you refuse to acknowledge. Every one of those injustices was defended in the name of order. Every one of those tragedies was justified by people who said the law must stand above feelings. Yet history remembers them not as guardians of justice, but as guardians of cruelty." Her words struck with such clarity that even those who had come in skeptical found themselves leaning forward, eyes locked on her. The tension was now electric, every heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of her delivery. The opponent tried to interject, their voice cracking slightly as they muttered about precedent and stability. But Crockett didn't flinch. She lifted her hand gently, palm outward, not to silence them rudely but to hold the floor with dignified authority. The gesture alone commanded respect. "You say stability comes from blind adherence," she said softly, almost like a teacher correcting a student. "I say stability comes from trust. And trust is born when people see themselves in the law, when they know the law recognizes their pain, their humanity, their truth. Without that, all you have is obedience built on fear. And fear has never been the foundation of lasting justice." A long silence followed. The camera zoomed in. The opponent's eyes darted nervously, beads of sweat forming along their hairline. The composure they had carried like armor was cracking under the weight of Crockett's moral clarity. Then came the moment, the turn that no one could have predicted. Crockett leaned back slightly, her voice lowering, inviting everyone in the room to lean closer. "You argue as though compassion weakens the law," she said. "But what if compassion is what gives the law its strength? The Constitution itself begins with the words, 'We the people.' Not, 'We the precedents,' not, 'We the enforcers.' People. Living, breathing human beings whose stories cannot be erased by doctrine or reduced to footnotes." There it was, the mic-drop truth, suspended in the air like a bell toll that could not be unheard. The chamber erupted. Some clapped instinctively before realizing decorum, others whispered furiously to their neighbors. The opponents sat frozen, their lips parted as if searching for words that simply would not come. Their silence was louder than any rebuttal. Crockett did not gloat. She did not smirk. Instead, she allowed the room to feel the power of her words. She looked across the audience, her eyes meeting those of young activists, weary elders, and hardened skeptics alike. Each of them seemed to feel seen, validated, as though her argument was not just about law but about them, about every struggle and every injustice that had too often been dismissed in the name of order. Finally, she spoke again, softly, almost tenderly. "If the law cannot listen, then it cannot lead. And if it cannot lead us toward justice, then it is nothing more than ink on paper." The final blow was not shouted. It was whispered with the certainty of truth, and it landed harder than any raised voice ever could. The opponent lowered their gaze. For the first time that day, they looked small, not because they were weak, but because their argument had been revealed for what it was, hollow. The cameras captured every second, the faces in awe, the barely contained energy in the room, the subtle nods of agreement even from unlikely corners. What had begun as a battle of law and order had transformed into something bigger, a moral reckoning. And as the chamber slowly regained composure, as murmurs turned into a steady buzz of excitement, one question lingered in every mind, unspoken yet undeniable. Had they just witnessed not merely a debate, but a turning point? Because in that moment, one truth had become inescapable: Jasmine Crockett had not just countered an argument. She had rewritten the terms of justice itself. The silence that followed Crockett's final words did not last long. Within minutes, the chamber dissolved into a storm of whispers, gasps, and hurried note-taking. Cameras panned across stunned faces, capturing the rare electricity of a moment destined to live far beyond those four walls. But the real eruption came not in the chamber, but in the world outside. By the time Crockett had stepped out of the building, her words had already leapt into the bloodstream of social media. The first clip hit Twitter within 5 minutes, shaky cell phone footage uploaded by someone in the audience. The caption was simple, almost breathless: "Did Jasmine Crockett just out-argue Justice Jackson?" Within an hour, that clip had crossed 500,000 views. By nightfall, it was everywhere. Hashtags blazed across timelines: hashtag Crockett was right, hashtag justice for the people, hashtag mic drop moment. Screenshots of her key line, "Silence is not justice, it is surrender," were plastered on Instagram stories and TikTok edits. One video looped the exact moment she raised her hand to hold the floor, adding dramatic music and bold text: "Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers." Commentators rushed to weigh in. Some, visibly rattled, insisted it was reckless for a congresswoman to publicly challenge a sitting Supreme Court justice. Others, though, called it historic. One viral tweet declared, "We may have just witnessed the birth of a new era in American political courage." Crockett didn't just argue the law. She argued for us. Cable news could not resist. That evening, primetime anchors led with the story. Split-screen debates filled the airwaves, legal experts, professors, politicians, each scrambling to interpret what this confrontation meant. On one network, a constitutional scholar leaned forward with barely contained excitement. She dismantled the myth that law is neutral, he said. And she did it with precision. This wasn't just passion, it was doctrine sharpened by lived experience. Another panelist shook her head in awe. I've taught constitutional law for 20 years. I've never seen someone strip away the pretense of order so surgically. She didn't just win the argument. She shifted the frame of the entire debate. Meanwhile, ordinary people felt the impact on a more personal level. A young activist from Detroit posted, "I've been in courtrooms where I was told to sit down, be quiet, respect the process, even as that process crushed my community. Today, I watched someone stand up and say exactly what I've been screaming inside." Thank you, Jasmine. Teachers pulled her words into classroom discussions. Faith leaders quoted her in sermons. Parents replayed the clip at the dinner table, explaining to their children why it mattered. And politicians, always attuned to shifting winds, took notice. A handful of representatives who had been lukewarm on social justice reforms suddenly found their voices, tweeting cautiously supportive statements. One senator, previously silent on related legislation, announced on live TV that Crockett's speech had crystallized something that had long been ignored. The ripple effect was undeniable. Think pieces poured out overnight, each racing to define the significance of the moment. Headlines declared, "The day Crockett changed the debate on justice." Law meets humanity in Crockett's mic drop. A clash that could redefine the court's moral compass. Even skeptics couldn't ignore the phenomenon. A conservative columnist, though critical, admitted begrudgingly, she has managed to place herself at the center of a national conversation in a way most lawmakers only dream of. Whether you agree with her or not, she proved she cannot be dismissed. And then came the late-night shows. Comedians replayed her line, adding punchlines, but the laughter only amplified the reach. Millions who hadn't seen the original debate suddenly knew her words by heart. What startled the establishment most was how quickly Crockett's framing replaced the opponent's. No longer were people repeating the mantra of order over feelings. Instead, the refrain echoing across the country was hers: the law must listen, or it cannot lead. The ground had shifted. What began as a chamber debate now felt like the opening salvo in a broader cultural shift. The clarity of her argument had cracked something open. People who had long felt dismissed, who carried wounds left by institutions, now had a new rallying cry. And they knew exactly who had given it to them. As the night wore on, one image crystallized the moment's impact. A photograph, snapped by an anonymous staffer, began circulating online. Crockett walking out of the chamber, head high, a faint but resolute smile on her face. Behind her, blurred in the background, the opponents sat hunched at the table, a stack of papers before them, gaze lowered. The photo was captioned, "This is what truth to power looks like." By morning, the photo was on the front page of nearly every major newspaper. Editorial boards called it courageous. Activists called it vindication. And young people across the country began to say it felt like something new, something hopeful, proof that the law could belong to them too. But beneath the celebration, another question pulsed, carrying both suspense and promise. If one act of defiance could spark this much change overnight, what might come next? When the dust of debate settled and the noise of social media reached its fever pitch, Crockett's message stood taller than any headline or hashtag. She did not retreat, nor did she gloat in victory. Instead, she clarified what the entire confrontation had been about from the very beginning. This was never about disrespecting the court, she told a gathering of reporters the next morning. Her voice was calm, steady, carrying none of the adrenaline of the clash but all of its conviction. It was about reminding all of us, judges, lawmakers, citizens, that justice cannot be real if it is deaf to lived experience. Law without humanity is not law. It's just words on paper. Her framing changed everything. Suddenly, what could have been painted as a brash act of defiance was reframed as an act of stewardship, a defense of the very values the law is meant to uphold. She wasn't tearing down institutions. She was demanding they rise to meet the people they claimed to serve. That distinction mattered. It turned a moment of confrontation into a lesson of universality. People across the country recognized themselves in her words: immigrants who had felt invisible, workers who had felt unheard, parents who feared their children's struggles were ignored. In Crockett's voice, they heard something bigger than politics. They heard a truth that affirmed their worth. The law must be responsive to the people it governs, she said, pausing just long enough for the weight of the words to sink in. Otherwise it isn't a compass, it's a cage. The clarity of that statement rippled outward, transcending the chamber, transcending the debate itself. Commentators framed it as the moral core of the entire showdown. Teachers underlined it in civics lessons. Activists scrawled it on posters. Ordinary citizens repeated it at dinner tables and church gatherings. For once, the lesson was not buried in fine print or tangled in legal jargon. It was plain, direct, and unshakable. The law is meant to serve humanity, not the other way around. And in that simplicity lay its power. Crockett's courage reframed what it means to challenge authority. It was not about defiance for its own sake. It was about honesty, having the integrity to name when the rules no longer reflected the realities of those living under them. That kind of honesty, she reminded the country, is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of service. Her words became not just a rebuke to a doctrine, but a call to conscience. If a single voice can pierce the silence of tradition, she said in her closing remarks, then every voice matters. Every one of us has the power to speak truth to power, not out of anger, but out of love for the future we all share. It was the kind of sentiment that transcended party, transcended courtroom and chamber walls. It was human. It was moral. And it was aspirational. The confrontation that began as a clash of authority had become something far greater, a reminder that justice must be alive, breathing, responsive. Crockett had not just challenged a justice of the Supreme Court, she had challenged the country to believe in its own power to demand better. And the country, it seemed, was ready to listen. As the story closed its circle, the lesson was unmistakable. Respecting institutions does not mean surrendering to their flaws. True respect is holding them accountable to their highest ideals. True patriotism is refusing to accept silence where justice demands a voice. In Crockett's defiance, people found dignity. In her composure, they found strength. And in her words, they found the universal truth they had been waiting to hear, that courage is contagious, and justice belongs to all who dare to claim it. The chamber lights may have dimmed. The cameras may have turned away. But the echo of her message carried on, not as an ending, but as a beginning. And as the headlines faded into memory, one truth remained etched in the nation's conscience: sometimes, it takes just one voice to remind us all of who we are. What began as a quiet chamber debate had transformed into something no one expected. Jasmine Crockett, a voice many thought too young, too untested to take on the highest levels of authority, had stood firm. And in that moment, when she calmly challenged Justice Jackson, when she refused to bow to the weight of precedent, something extraordinary happened. She turned what could have been political suicide into a moment of triumph that stunned the nation and left legal experts scrambling for words. This wasn't just a clash of arguments. It was a revelation that courage is not measured by volume, but by clarity. That truth, spoken with composure, has the power to pierce even the thickest walls of tradition. And that sometimes, the greatest victories are born from the risk of standing alone. The video title says it all: Jasmine Crockett disagrees with Justice Brown Jackson, what happens next shocks legal experts. And it did. The shock wasn't just in the argument. It was in the undeniable fact that one voice, armed with conviction, can reset the terms of a national conversation. But here's the part that matters most: this story isn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It's about us. About the power each of us holds to question, to challenge, to demand that justice reflect lived reality. Her stand was a spark. What happens next depends on how many of us are willing to carry that fire forward. So if you believe in speaking truth to power, if you believe that courage is more powerful than arrogance, then join this movement. Like, share, and subscribe to be part of the next chapter in this fight for justice. The story isn't over, and neither is our voice.